Welcome to the Expansion Pack Podcast, a show where we unlock the world through story. There's no cheat codes or restarts in life, but we can learn from one another to expand the world around us. So gear up, press start, and dive in. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us again. I'm your host, TK Johnson, author and lover of stories. I have not experienced a lot of the world, which is why I'm interviewing people who have amazing stories to tell, stories that we can grow and learn from. I'm here for part 2 of my interview with Karina Hale. If you haven't listened to part 1, please stop, go back, where Karina tells the story of what her family has been through and the different events that has just changed their family and just turned their eyes even more towards the Lord, into their faith, and just solidifying why they believe what they believe. But this part 2 is kind of really to talk more about the nitty gritty, the practical steps. We've heard your story. We've heard a little bit of what you've been through, a very surface level of the events of your life. And now I want to dive in a little deeper. You mentioned you want to talk specifically more about the accident. We're going to do that. We're going to talk about how to help your marriage through these times, how to talk to your kids, why does God cause us to live without fear and then send these terrifying situations into our lives? So, Karina, I'm going to put the ball in your court. Where do you want to start here?
Well, I would love to start with the practicality of, we talked about if God calls us to live without fear, how do we do that?
Yes. So please change my life with this answer because I need it.
Yeah. I'm a big believer in having the tools to do something. You can't do it unless you know where to start. And sometimes that's so daunting,
Even God gave Noah directions to build the ark.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So I am here to tell you it starts right now. It starts today. And it starts by spending time in his word. And I think that will probably be a very common thread. If you listen to both of these, it starts with his word and it ends with his word. But if you ask me, how do I live life without fear? I'm going to tell you, let's go to the word of God. And so do you know that we're going to find 365 times, don't fear, do not fear.
365. That seems to be equivalent to days of the year.
That's what I'm saying. So,
amazing.
Yeah. So if he tells us 365 times, we know that there is literally daily instruction. So he makes it so practical for us. So when we spend time with him, we learn that he tells us that he'll fight for us in Exodus. We learn that even in the valley of the shadow of death, he'll comfort us. We learn that he's our light and our salvation and our stronghold. Why should we fear? Foundationally, he tells us that when we seek him, he'll deliver us from all our fears. He's very present with us in our trouble. So instead of fear, we can choose to trust. And those are maybe 5 or 6 of those rich passages that will teach us that he is present with us and that he'll walk us through. I always call him my faithful chauffeur through the darkness of the hardships of life. And I would love, Caitlin, to share these things with you so that if people want to go back and see these passages, just to make it available, because these are our steps, our tools.
Yes.
How to do it. So
yes, all references, resources, and verses that Karina shares, they will be up on my website, tkjohnsonbooks.com. We'll have a link in the description for the podcast, and then just look for the section about podcasting and the Expansion Pack podcast. That way you can go search in your own Bibles for these verses, highlight them, sticky note them, underline them, whatever you do in your own Bible. So any day of the year, you can go back and look at some of these.
Yep. Yep. Something else you mentioned was, how much Americans have it easy.
Yes. Oh yeah.
And how do we wrap our heads around God saying to us as Christians that there will be suffering? And I actually just love that question because our suffering looks so different from everyone else's, right? I mean, yes. You and I, if we're going to try to relate through our suffering, we don't have very many ways that we can relate to each other, do we? I mean,
No, no, not
you
at all.
know,
Mm-hmm.
so everyone's suffering is so different. And often they'll say, well, what I'm going through is nothing compared to yours, but it's suffering and it's hard nonetheless.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that God has a plan for our lives, and thank God we don't know his plan ahead of time because I may have quit a long time ago. And if I'm going to be vulnerable and be honest,
Mm-hmm.
I may have quit a long time ago. So
Mm-hmm.
thank God I don't know tomorrow. But yours being completely different. We might be talking about losing parents at a young age. We might be talking about suffering from anxiety or depression, which this is so applicable to. We might be talking about too many bills and not enough money.
Mm.
We might be talking about infertility. And how long could this list go? We could finish the rest of the podcast with just listing people's sufferings. But the point is our gaze, God says, doesn't need to be focused on our suffering, but it needs to be laser focused on God, who is the author and finisher of our faith. The Bible even says, don't let your gaze look to the left or to the right. Fix your gaze straight in front of you.
Mm.
He's our prize. So that's all I can offer to that, is that, we don't know what's coming, that when our eyes are fixed right in front of us, that he will not allow us to stray. There won't be anything to the left or to the right that we are distracted by, because our gaze is fixed right in front of us.
That point you make about suffering is suffering, it looks different, but is it not still suffering? There are times in my life where I have suffered from panic attacks for a long time. I didn't know what they were, but it's just all of a sudden my mind is thinking about death. It's thinking in detail about what it must be like to die in certain ways. I wonder about what is the meaning of life? What's the purpose of life? If we, all these existential questions, and I can't seem to pull my mind out of it. It's like something just takes over, and it's an irrational fear that I can't explain. It takes, trembling body, nauseous feeling. But I used to always think, maybe I'm not a good Christian. Maybe I'm not strong enough in my faith because I haven't actually experienced suffering. And I know that my husband helped me to realize these moments, these panic attacks, that is a kind of suffering. Maybe your trials from the Lord aren't so much external of things that happen to you. Maybe they're more internal, of controlling your mind. And I know it's not always a choice. Our mental health is not always something you can just flip a switch and say, I choose to be happy today. That's not how it always works. Sometimes it's a lifetime of struggle. But he said, maybe that is your struggle. That is your suffering. And so I just love that you pointed out suffering looks different to different people. And even the example you gave in the first part, you were at the grocery store, eyes down, you had lost your smile, you said. That is suffering that you don't see. Yeah, you see someone in a wheelchair with no legs. Maybe they're a vet. Okay, that's very obvious suffering. But there is the suffering happening all around us that we don't always see. Yeah. And I think, again, as Americans, I think of the suffering other people experience in other countries, the news that we hear about. And I think, I haven't suffered at all compared to what's happening. But it just makes me wonder if that comparison game is dangerous, even in that way. But like you said, it's not about looking at the suffering. It's about looking to Christ. It's about keeping your eyes straight ahead. One of my favorite verses is 2 Corinthians, I think it's 3:10. And this is terrible. I'm bad with numbers, but I'm like, Lord, help me remember these references. But it's, we are human, but we do not wage war as humans do. We use God's mighty weapons, not the weapons of earth, to destroy our enemies, because our enemy is not going to be beaten with a physical metal sword. We have the armor of God to fight his wars. And it looks so different than what we picture or what we see in the movies or read in books. So I love that you pointed that out, because I think that will be so freeing and so eye-opening to a lot of people.
I can't help but think too, at the end of that passage that you quoted,
Mm-hmm.
it says taking every thought captive and making it obey Christ.
Yes.
And I mean, doesn't that just set us free when we make those wrong thoughts or bad thoughts or untrue thoughts, make them obey. Yeah. And when they obey, you know what I mean? Like that's where we work. So I love that.
Yeah. And in today's world where we are getting so much more focused on mental health, it's funny because I say you can't just flip a switch, but there are things you can do to take control of your thoughts again. There are methods, there's like the five senses. I forget the exact thing, but it's like touch one thing, smell two things, you know, listen to like pick out three different noises. You use your senses to help get your mind out of whatever pit of despair you are in, to get you away from those negative thoughts and turn your thoughts to something around you to pull yourself out of it. And it's amazing how God designed our bodies to help our mind and vice versa, on how
Yep.
we can use our mind to overcome physical trials and difficulties as well.
Yep.
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 All right. So, we talked about, what's like the American suffering. I'm just kind of going through my notes here. How does God call us to live without fear when there is terrifying things happening around us? You touched on this a little bit. Scripture and going to the word is the thing you're going to always point back to, but what is your daily routine or weekly? What does that look like to you to always be leading a Christ-like family and to be leading your life as a Christian yourself?
Yep. So this is my favorite part of the day, actually, is when I get to get up. So I love to wake up because I am a homeschool mom of 6. So I'm never alone, ever. So when that golden hour, 5 a.m. rolls around, somewhere in that 5 a.m. hour, I'm not saying it's 5 exactly, but when I roll out of that bed, I love that time. So what I love is that it's still, it's quiet. I have no distractions. I get to watch the sunrise. But the consistent choosing of this time, that is where you're going to become rooted and grounded in your faith. And we talked about this. We talked about what are some tools? What are the right steps? And that's when I said, well, it starts today. So if you want to be ready to have a deeply rooted faith, pick up that Bible today. Listen to a podcast perhaps of a good pastor if you don't have time to sit down. But I would strongly encourage you to make the time. If that's setting your alarm for a half hour earlier, getting up and opening the word, do it. So I am up early, like I said, and I have my prayer time. I read the word. I often write the word. And then often I'm also reading a book along with my quiet time that will uplift and encourage me in my faith. So I also want to add too that my time with the Lord doesn't end after that hour and a half in the morning. I'm standing doing the dishes and I can be pouring my heart out to God, which I love. I can be driving down the road to a doctor or to a friend, and I can be talking to the Lord because, it says that he wants us to pour out our hearts to him because he cares. And so I get to talk to him all day long, but the morning is my specific time.
All right, Karina. So some of us have that age-old issue where we open our Bibles and we're like, oh my gosh, this is so boring. It's so much ancestry, or I've heard this so many times. I grew up in the church. We talked about this in Sunday school. Like, I get it. I've memorized the Beatitudes. Or it's prayer time and we find ourselves just our mind wanders or we're falling asleep again. What are your fixes to some of that? Like, do you have advice? Because I feel like those are the stereotypical pitfalls to morning or evening, our quiet time with Jesus. Those are the things that always stop us or that trip us up.
Yep. Well, I would wonder, in those pitfalls or in those dry times, I think that maybe you begin with asking the Lord to make it alive again, because, where I have read the story of Job, I don't know how many times, I come back to it and I see at the end that he is begging God's forgiveness for the pride that was in his own heart. It almost doesn't make sense. It almost blows your mind. Like, all this happened to him, but he's asking for God's forgiveness for his sin of, questioning God and challenging him, or that we have a God that shut the mouths of lions. Like, it almost can't get old. So it might just be more of an issue of that's what you've allowed. And so I would ask the Lord to bring it back to life,
Mm.
and to stir your affections for him again, and to make you stand in awe of what our God can do. And that's part of why I love sharing our story, because look at what our God can do.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I guess, what I would offer, and think may be the best, is talk to him and ask him to wake your heart up again.
Yeah. Well, for our mommies and daddies listening in, this might be the part that they really came back for.
Yep.
How do you teach that to your children? A lot of it, I just remember always hearing growing up, like children learn from their parents' examples. If you see your parents reading their Bible, if you see your parents having that devotion time, that quiet time with Jesus, the kid learns too as well. But I feel like it's more than that. Yes, a child can see that, but how does a child know what to read or what to pray? How do you teach that to your children? And especially, how did that end up playing into the hardships that happened? I want to get back into talking about the car accident, especially because
Yeah.
that was, I feel like, harder, a harder
Yeah.
moment, and that we've only skimmed it. So help guide us through
Yeah.
how you guys taught your kids, how to prepare them for what was coming without them
Sure.
even knowing.
Yeah. So this is a bigger answer, mainly because, we're talking about, a daily routine with our kids,
Mm-hmm.
but then how to have tough conversations with them as well. And so, yes, they do need to see you in the word, or you and your husband praying together, or praying with you. And so there are practical things you can do. Quiet times with them. I've done a lot of Bible studies with my kids. I have um, some benefits on my side where I homeschool, so I get to spend hours with my kids. And so instead of memorizing a quick verse for Awana on Wednesday night, we get to memorize chapters and
Mm.
chapters and chapters during school. So, those are blessings and benefits that I have that maybe mostly, probably most women don't have. Most moms don't get that opportunity.
Yeah.
So, but if we're going to just address that quickly, have high expectations for your kids, because they are capable, they're
Mm.
smart, they are able.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just say that. But helping them, they're children, and they need you to be the adult, and they need you to teach them how to walk with God. That's not something that any of us know how to do without direction,
Yeah.
And so, yes, to see you, but also, hey, how was your quiet time today? Let's talk about it. Oh, it was about, let's go back to maybe Daniel in the lion's den. It was about Daniel in the lion's den. What does that mean to you? How does that apply to your life in 2021? Because that was a long time ago. So what does that mean to you, son?
Yeah. Our lines look different these days. Our pits look different these days. Mhm.
Absolutely. And God's still closing the mouths,
Yep. Yep.
And so, yeah, so we can help them learn a faith that is deeply rooted, just by leading with small conversations, but lacing it throughout your whole day, because he is our life. The Bible says Christ is our life. And so it's not just that he's the quiet time part of our life when we wake up, or he's not just the prayer before our lunch. He is our life. And so whatever situation we face, whether it's a lack of obedience the first time, or whether it's, facing something really hard, he is our life. And so there are ways even to bridge that. And I guess I want to then just maybe move into how to have those hard conversations with them when it comes to facing hard things as a family.
Yes. Yeah.
I guess to preface, I'm a pretty positive person. I'm also very excited to go to heaven. And I don't think that that's very normal the older I get. But it does change the way I look at death. And I think especially when it's a child, or when it's someone that obviously knew the Lord. So we've seen many, many children die. Within just 1 year after Seth being sick, we were at 15 different funerals of kids under 12. And and that's not even to mention the normal deaths of grandparents or just elderly people in your life. And so we're big, very, very big on drawing the attention of our kids to heaven. and to the God of heaven. And so we've said many times, our little friend so-and-so, our little friend Wyatt, who's in my mind right now. Our little friend Wyatt beat us to heaven. And he gets to hug Jesus, and he gets to hold his hand on streets of gold, and I cannot wait to join him. I cannot wait. And I'm being very genuine with you. I cannot wait to join Wyatt in heaven. And so I'll say to the kids, I wonder what his mansion looks like, because my kids have prayed for decorations in their mansion, like, Mario wallpaper or whatever, pool in the backyard.
You know what's gonna be hilarious is when Jesus is like, remember back when you were this old? Welcome to your Mario room.
Yes. But it's so important too to balance that positivity and the truth of scripture with sitting down and crying with your kids. Like, we have a children's pastor that died this year from our church, and listen, this man couldn't wait to go to heaven, and he told everyone about it. But you know what? That doesn't mean that we didn't need to sit down and cry and express, we are going to miss Pastor Ken. We love him. We miss his smile. We miss his enthusiasm, and God made us to love vulnerably. So to teach our kids that crying is just as much love as, the happiness and excitement of knowing that he's in heaven. It all expresses love, and God made us to love that way.
Yeah.
And so when we love through death, it does honor God, even in our tears. And so to acknowledge that over and over again while faithfully reminding them of truth is, I think, of utmost importance.
So talk to me more about the car accident. I want to talk about a specific time where you had to bring news to your kids, or you had to handle the news yourselves too, because that was a phone call. I mean, I know you said you were on the road, you're in front of them, but I don't think you looked in your rearview mirror and saw what happened. It was a phone call. You had to go react to it. You had to tell Kurt what happened. He wasn't with you. The other kids had to be informed of what was going on, because suddenly it's not a beach day anymore. You guys live a short ways from the beach. You're in Florida. All of a sudden, this normal day going to the beach has suddenly changed. What was that like? How did you handle those conversations?
So I will be as brief as possible, but I have to be honest that walking through this stuff, man, it makes it so real. I, like I said, I was about 3 miles ahead of my family, my boys in the other car, and my dad was driving, and it was actually my dad who called me. And he was in complete shock. He said, Karina, we've been in an accident. I turned my car around, and my dad called me. So naturally, it's probably not that bad, right? If he's able to hold his call, yeah, it's probably not a big deal. And so honestly, I thought I was going to throw him in my Suburban, and we were still going to the beach. So we turned around, and traffic was already backed up about 1.5 miles. And so I put my car in park. My sister happened to be in the car with me. She got up in the driver's seat in case traffic moved at all. And I ran from where we parked up to the accident scene. And when I got there, I saw the semi up on top of my dad's car, and the last ambulance pulling away with my boys in the car. Thankfully, a policeman gave me a ride back to my car. And I will tell you that I found Toby Mac's song Till the Wheels Fall Off, and I turned it up as loud as my baby's ears could handle. And that talks about, till the day I die, Lord, I am yours. So whatever you call me to, whatever I'm about to face at this hospital, I'm yours. And I am choosing right now to be faithful with whatever we're about to face. And then the next song, same, was by Toby Mac, and it is called not Indescribable. I'll get back to you on the name. Regardless, Undeniable. Undeniable you are. And you're the bright and morning star, yet you care for my heart. And Oh, it talks about the kids who the doctor said would never make it.
Mm.
And yet, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
And so
man.
I, I spent that whole drive, which is about 40 minutes, offering my praise to God and my worship to God in preparation for what I was about to face.
Mm.
I called Kurt, obviously, on that drive, and I stopped and picked him up. He was waiting on the side of the road for me. Thankfully, we are self-employed, so he was able to just park and wait for me. And when we got to the hospital, I told you in the previous podcast that Seth's face was blasted with glass,
Mm-hmm.
and Jaden had the brain injury and the skull fracture, and then the unknown stomach muscle and
Yeah.
artery issues. And so when we got into the room, it was this big double room at the ER. We look over at Seth, and I almost fell to my knees because Seth looked like he was about to die.
Mm.
He had blood everywhere and glass everywhere. He couldn't open his eyes. He couldn't talk. His nose was broken.
Mm.
And I thought he was about to die. And I look over at Jaden, and he's not conscious, but he looks perfect. He looks like an angel. There's not a scrape on the child.
Mm.
And so then they told us Seth is going to be just fine, but Jaden needs to be rushed in for emergency brain surgery.
And you thought, did you get their names right?
Exactly.
Oh, wow.
So they took him back for surgery. We stayed with Seth as long as we could until they had to, remove all the glass. But I would fast forward to 3 nights. So we get through his surgeries, and he is on life support for 4 days.
I'm going to pause you real quick. Did you know that they had to resuscitate him 3 times? Or did they save that information until he was kind of through a little bit more?
We found out in rounds on day 5, because it didn't happen. He wasn't resuscitated until during surgery.
Okay.
Because he was bleeding out and they didn't know why.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes. I remember.
Yeah.
Okay. So
they brought him back 3 times, and then they gave him all the blood and figured out the issues. And
so tell us one more time. So they knew about the brain injury and brain damage.
Yep.
And how long was it until they figured out about the internal bleeding and the stomach issue?
So they started the surgery, and he was in surgery for 10 hours. And all during surgery, his artery was bleeding out and his muscle in his stomach was torn. And so at hour 10, his stomach was completely distended and he was dying.
Mm. And that's when they're like, oh, there is other stuff happening. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And so fast forward 3 days or 4 days actually, when we were going to take him off of life support and see what happened. Mm-hmm. We had no idea. And I will say, I haven't talked about that night. That is, to this day, the hardest night of my life. Mm-hmm. So they took Jaden, they extubated him, which means they just took out the tube that was in his throat and that was helping him breathe. And he responded. They said he'll start coughing, and he had a softball size blood clot come out of his mouth, out of his throat, because of all the internal bleeding that he had going on. And he woke up very combative. Obviously, he had no idea what was going on. He had to be roped down to his bed, and he still somehow got his hand to his nose and his mouth and pulled out tubes that we had to put back in that night. And so for sure the hardest night of my life to date. So yeah.
Man, I'm trying myself not to tear up. And I know we've talked about this, and you're a very emotionally strong person. But man, you lived through all this. And I don't know how, I mean, you've told the story a lot, but these harder moments, I don't know how you're not just losing it, because man, he's not my son, and I see him once every couple of years and I'm about to lose it. So I don't even know, like, how did you tell your kids, the other kids? How did
So
you tell Seth? They are best friends, Seth and Jaden. How did you explain to Seth what was happening with Jaden?
yeah. So with Eric and Lydia, our twins, they were like 6, I think, at the time, and maybe 7. And so they actually saw the semi up on the car as well. They were in
Okay.
my car and we had to drive by it. So they saw, but they didn't know at that point. And thankfully, we had aunts and some family in town that cared for them while we were at the hospital. And actually, I couldn't even be the one to tell them because I was at the hospital with
Yeah.
the other boy. But we did talk to Seth and we kept him in the loop. And we have always found it very important to tell the age appropriate truth to our kids, you know? So we don't lie to them. We don't make things, we don't sugarcoat very much. We tell the truth as much
Yeah.
as is appropriate. And so Seth didn't speak actually for a couple of weeks. And when he came into Jaden's room for the first time and saw him, it was gut wrenching for him and for anyone who was around him.
Well, and by
So
the time he was out of surgery, I know you said before Jaden looked fine. It was Seth who looked a mess. So by the time he was out of surgery, I mean, he did have bandages, he did have the tubes, the wires, all of that. And
yes,
for Seth, with him being the one with leukemia, it was different. He was the one experiencing it. Everyone else saw him that way. So this was really Seth's first time seeing a sibling in that situation.
yes,
Mhm.
yep, and they are best friends. That cancer, journey really solidified their relationship as best
Mm.
friends. And
Mm.
so to fast forward to this, where they're facing losing each other again, or one or the other, is
Mhm.
they are just cemented.
Hmm.
So yes,
I love it. Just a quick example, you posted about them opening bank accounts, and the man asked, "Who do you want to be your beneficiary?" And they looked at each other, pointed to each other.
that
I
is,
thought that is perfect.
I love that too. Yep. So
Man.
yeah,
All right. The one thing we haven't touched on as much was marriage. In
yes,
your guys's marriage, what do you do? I mean, you mentioned date nights, you've mentioned how you help other couples. And in the first part of this podcast with you, you talked about how it's so important to make sure you take care of your marriage. Your child is not God. You know, it's not all about your children. Take care of your marriage as well. What are things that you and Kurt do to keep your marriage strong? You have 6 kids now. You had 2 babies born after these events of your guys' lives. So what do you do to keep your marriage healthy, to make sure you're both in an open, safe, honest place with one another all the time, that the kids don't take over your lives and marriage gets put on the back burner?
yep. Well, I do want to offer
Mhm.
to all any married person listening that if you want to communicate love to your kids, then love your spouse,
Mm.
because your kids will feel so secure and so loved when they see you loving your husband and your husband loving you. So that may be one of the best pieces of advice that I'll give this whole time, because sometimes we forget that,
Mm.
or don't
So
even know. Go
so
ahead.
PDA is encouraged. We want
Absolutely.
PDA in the home.
Listen, my kids and all kids, they act like, ugh, dad, quit pinching her booty, or quit kissing her on the neck when she's doing dishes or whatever, quit dancing in the kitchen.
Mm.
But honestly, that offers them security, especially in an insecure world where marriages, all of their friends' marriages, their friends' parents' marriages are ending
Mhm.
daily, So what better gift can you give them? But I will specifically speak to families that are going through any sort of suffering, um, and speak to some tools that you can put in
Yes.
place.
Yeah.
Um, I think first and foremost is offering grace to your spouse, because your spouse is not going to grieve in the same way as you do. And
Mm.
if you expect your spouse to grieve in the same way as you do, you're going to be fighting all the time.
Mm.
So for me, I need to talk and I need to cry, where my husband needs to be quiet and he needs to process. And so if I expect him to talk all the time and to cry with me all the time, and I'm hurt when he doesn't, well, that can cause some issues.
Mhm.
However, it's great for him to meet me in the middle and for him to learn to be vulnerable and talk and shed a tear when things are really hard. That's okay too. That's good. It's just I can't expect him to grieve the same way as I do.
Mhm.
So give grace.
Yeah.
Um, Secondly, I would say pray together as often as you can, whether it's in front of your kids or behind closed doors. Pray together, because one of the most intimate things that you can do in marriage, obviously aside from any sexual intimacy,
Mhm.
is praying together. When you're talking to the Lord about what's in your heart, those are things, like things spill out of your mouth that are hidden deep in your heart, and that gives your spouse an opportunity to look through into a window of what's going on in your heart. And so I would say pray as much as you can together. And then lastly, I would say, yes, date. We talked about that. I would say date weekly. If you can date weekly, date
Mhm.
weekly. But I would also say that at least every few months, intentionally put a getaway on the calendar. If it's one night, then get away for one night. Whether you're a parent or not, I want to add,
Mhm.
because changing your settings and and your surroundings, and it does not have to be expensive. Go camping, you know,
Yeah.
go to go to a quaint bed and breakfast in a nearby town or whatever, but intentionally escape and enjoy the excitement of getting away, the encouragement of conversation that is sparked by new surroundings. Um, but it really does encourage a depth of love for each other when you carve out intentional time in those ways.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And it's
Yeah.
so funny that you bring that up because I don't think that's something people think of. Oh, yes, date night. You need time alone away from the
Yeah.
kids, but to leave to change your settings, that's huge.
Yeah.
Again, in the last episode, I briefly mentioned mental health and the different tools available to us these days, but that's one of them. And it's crazy. You're in the middle of a panic attack or you have depression or anxiety. They tell you change your settings. It changes the way your mind is seeing the world, how it reacts to things. And so it's funny that it works the same way with relationships,
Yep.
that it's, if we're struggling or we just need to relax, get away, whatever it may be, change your settings because it makes your mind think differently. It helps you communicate more. Yeah, that's amazing that you brought that up. And again, I don't think people would think of that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Very important when
Yeah.
possible, you know?
Yes. Yeah.
Yep.
And I think the vulnerability that you're talking about too, we have learned in our marriage, it's so easy to say sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. But switching it around to say, will you forgive me is a game changer. It
For
makes you
sure.
wonder, are you really sorry? It really is vulnerable. It opens you up in a way that you couldn't imagine saying, will you forgive me instead of I'm sorry? Like you're asking for them to come and tell you that it's okay for what you did, that forgiveness is huge, and just changing that language that you use in your marriage changes so much too. And so when you talk about yeah, just praying together, it being vulnerable, I mean, I think that that's an insight into our spiritual lives, and then the everyday language that we use changes as well,
Yep.
the way we honor each other and show each other grace.
Yes. So
Yeah.
important. Yep.
Yeah. All right,
Yeah.
Karina, I think we've covered most of the big points I've had. Is there anything else you want to talk about? Having six kids, living, a farmstead lifestyle, homeschooling, the accident, anything else you want to touch on?
I would say the only other things that we didn't really touch on were the lighthearted things.
Mm.
You asked about some of the comments that I received
Oh,
about
yes.
having six kids. And
Yes.
I would say most remarks I receive are laced with negativity.
Mm.
Um, I quickly then, because people are not embarrassed to make negative remarks in front of kids about what a burden they are.
Wow.
And so I quickly try to turn them into positive. So just to share a couple.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
One is, wow, you've got your hands full.
Mm.
To which I quickly respond, better full than empty. We know what it's like to almost lose them.
Yep.
And I love to quickly make people feel awkward about what a rude comment they just made.
You just made my child feel like they're not worth the space in the world, you know?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
No.
Yep.
Mm-mm.
And I think the only other one to mention is, oh, God bless you. And I
He sure
love
has.
that's exactly what I respond.
Ugh.
He sure has blessed me. And those are only two of a plethora of comments that we receive when we're in public. But those are two of my favorites that we have the answer down pat.
Yeah. When you had first told me that you get comments for having 6 kids, I right away went to, oh, it must be like about going green and environmental friendliness, that the amount of resources humans use, it's not good
Yeah,
for our environment. And
right.
that's immediately where my mind went. I forget that people are Southern charming, as it's referred to as, oh, bless your heart, you have 6 kids, or, oh, you've got your hands full,
Yeah,
nice little smiles, but saying such negative things. So
yeah, yeah.
thank you for those great ways to spin that around a little bit, because you're right. Better hands full than hands empty.
Yes.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
You've got 10 little fingers and they have been there for
Yeah.
10 babies of yours.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yes. Yep. Yep. So, I mean, the only other thing that you asked about that we
Mhm.
didn't quite hit was just about why we have moved to a farm, a mini
Yeah.
farm.
Yes.
And I would just say that it was either a beach shack or a farmhouse. And 8 people don't fit in a beach shack. So the farmhouse is more practical. And I guess in all seriousness, we wanted to give our kids the experiences of animals, eggs, and cow milk, and
Chores. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, the hard work, homegrown food,
Mhm.
um, and that it's rewarding when we get to do it together. And so, not to mention exploration and tree climbing and a big enough house for 8 people,
Mhm.
um, and places where they can have their own space. And so this has been just a joy, to maintain cows and chickens and hopes for
Yeah,
more one day. So yeah,
definitely.
yep.
Well, Karina, thank you so very much for being so open, so vulnerable, for talking about some of those darkest moments that you've not shared before, at least, with a large group of people. I appreciate it. I really think that God has used these things that have happened in your life to touch lives, and you have seen it firsthand. I've heard stories. But I'm hoping that you sharing this story again touches more lives. It helps open our minds a little bit more and our hearts to what God is capable of in all the amazing ways, how God can rescue and restore. So thank you. The resources, references, verses that you shared are all going to be available at tkjohnsonbooks.com under my podcast section. And if you have questions for Karina, maybe this is your first time hearing her story. Maybe you've heard it 1,000 times, but something she said really just sparked something in you and you want to know more. Please reach out, email me at tkjohnsonbooks@gmail.com. All of my guests, I am going to take, if people have questions, I'm going to take those questions, maybe have you back to answer them on an episode, or just to share and, over social media, some of the answers if people want to know more or want more resources. So again, that's tkjohnsonbooks@gmail.com if you have questions or are looking for more. Thank you so much, Karina. I appreciate this. I know that you're always open to tell these stories, but I just appreciate again how open and vulnerable you have been to get into the hard stuff and the practical stuff, those
Yeah.
wonderful tips. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Expansion Pack podcast. For information about our guests, references, or resources mentioned in this episode, visit tkjohnsonbooks.com. Have a question for our host or guest? Visit their specific episode on the website to ask us. As you continue your day, don't forget to expand your life through listening to the stories around you. Thank you, and see you next time.